Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Eaton. I am the Secretary of the Rare Breeding Birds Panel. And this evening, I'm going to talk to you about the work of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel. In fact, I'll slip slides and you can see what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to talk about the work of the panel. I'm going to talk about monitoring in general, why we should monitor rare breeding birds and indeed all our bird populations in the UK. I'm going to talk a little bit about that monitoring, but I'm going to spend more time talking about the Rare Breeding Birds Panel, the RBBP. Some of you may be familiar with us, but I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who've never heard of us and don't know what we do. So I'll talk about that. I'll then talk about rare breeding birds a bit. We published our latest annual report for 2023 earlier this week. So it's really hot off the press stuff, the latest news about rare breeding birds. So I'm going to spend a while talking about our birds and how they're doing. And then finally, the reason I'm here really is to campaign, to persuade, cajole people to help us with our work in recording rare breeding birds. So I'm going to talk about Essex and the rare breeding birds you have and how you can help us with our work. So the first of those was about why we should monitor our birds and why the work of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel, for example, monitoring rare breeders, is valuable. Well, there's a number of reasons I've thrown up on slides here. First one is to enable us to set conservation priorities, because it's a sad fact of life that we don't have all the resources, all the funding, really, to do all the conservation that we want in the UK. We can't work on all the species everywhere all the time. So we have to prioritize. We have to be very clever about selecting what to work on to make the best use of what resources we have. And one of the ways we do that for birds is exercises such as the Birds of Conservation Concern lists. These are the red, amber and green lists, which we put all of our regularly occurring bird species onto. Red being the species that we're most concerned about, amber, moderate concern, the green list being those species we have less concern about. And to do this, it's a rule-based assessment process, taking all the best quality data we have about how our birds are doing, how big their populations are, what the trends are, how concentrated they are on sites, all sorts of issues, and assessing them by standardized criteria. So we need good data, and the data that we provide from the Rare Breeding Bird Panel on population sizes and trends for a whole range of rare breeding bird species allows them to be properly assessed against through these Birds of Conservation Concern processes. The last one of these was published in 2021, 4 years ago. There'll be a new one coming along in a couple of years' time. So because of our data on Montagu's Harrier, for example, the data that the Rare Breeding Birds Panel collects on breeding population sizes over the years, and unfortunately how that population has declined in recent years. So you can see in this graph in front of you how actually about 50 years ago there were hardly any in the UK. In fact, there were a couple of years, 1974, 1975, where there were no breeding pairs at all. The dark bars on this graph are confirmed breeding pairs. The paler, so the pinker color is what possible and probable breeding pairs. So maybe birds on territory, but that we didn't actually get down to nesting. And we can see how the population grew through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then a little while after the turn of the century started to decline. And in fact, it's declined quite steeply. And it stopped breeding in 2019. So we've had a four-year period up to 23, our last report, with no breeding Montagu's Harriers at all. It's because of that decline that Montagu's Harrier is now red listed as a bird of conservation concern. So our data allowed us to put it on that red list to make sure it gets the conservation attention it deserves. If you keep your ear to the ground, you might have heard news, it was in the press earlier this year, that they have actually bred in 2025. So there is some hope for Montagu's Harrier. We can also use the data we collect, that's at a species level, that sort of priority setting, but we can use it, we can pool it to report more widely about how nature is doing. Things like wild bird indicators, assessments of how our wider environment is doing. For example, this graph is the UK government's priority species indicator. This is the average trend of species which are listed as priorities by any of the four national governments, national conservation agencies for the UK, for the four countries. Any of the species they've identified as conservation priorities, combining trends for those species. And you can see how over the last 50 years or so, on average, populations of those priorities, there's about 250 species contributing to this graph, have declined by over 60%. And there's quite a lot of our rare breeding bird data contributing to this graph, which enables us to see how well we're doing at saving, conserving, protecting our most threatened species, which, as you can see, is not particularly well, because they have continued to decline even in recent years when they're receiving that conservation attention. If we didn't do our job of monitoring these species and collecting the data, we wouldn't be able to have these sorts of assessments. As well as understanding how our wildlife is doing, our data can feed into research, looking at why what we observe happening to our wildlife is happening. So, for example, we can understand the impact of climate change on our bird populations. This graph here is just one example, looking at the average latitude of singing common quail in the UK using rare breeding bird panel data. And that black line through those dots is the average latitude in any given year, starting from 1986 onwards. And that black line shows the trend through that. And you can see that over time, over that 35 years, the average latitude of a quail has shifted steadily north. In fact, that line is about 5 kilometers a year. So every year, our quail, when they return from southern Europe, northern Africa, to breed in midsummer in barley fields and grasslands and so forth in the UK, they're shifting further north every year. An impact of climate change, as we've seen with many species. The data we hold can also inform conservation responses. So as well as directing, prioritizing, seeing how nature is doing more widely, researching what the problems are, it can then help the response to help our biodiversity. One thing that rare breeding bird panel data is particularly valuable and has been used particularly often over the years is in identifying the most important places for birds. In particular, the government are quite keen on our data so they can identify areas for designation as protected areas. So as special protection areas for their bird populations or as sites of special scientific interest. So our data can be mined to find where the most important populations of red-throated divers or golden eagles or Dartford warblers are in order to protect those areas. It can also be then used to assess those areas. Are they doing their job? Are the populations of birds that these sites were designated for actually prospering because of that designation or not? In fact, in the last year, I've done quite a lot of work with our data to help Natural England review the special protection area in the UK for various species to work out whether it's working, whether it's complete, and whether they need to identify new sites for protection, better management to help bitterns and avocets and spoonbills and other species. So actually informing conservation, direct conservation work. And then, of course, if that works, our ongoing monitoring, the trends we produce can then measure effectiveness. And in some cases, we get to show nice graphs, such as for bittern, where we can demonstrate how conservation has worked. So you can see from this graph showing numbers of bitterns. They were virtually extinct in the UK in the 1990s, basically just hanging on at Minsmere, not far from you on the Suffolk coast. And then we can see from around the turn of the century, a concerted programme of better wetland management, wetland creation, and a better understanding, in fact, of what requirements bittern had, allowed this recovery, this really quite impressive recovery to now over 300 booming males. Similar to the Montagu's Harrier, the dark bars show no nests, so confirmed breeding pairs. The paler are the sort of total number of likely breeding pairs, mainly booming males. And you shouldn't be alarmed that about 2014 there's a big sudden drop off in the number of confirmed pairs reported. That's basically because it got to the point where it was very obvious bitterns were doing quite well, and the RBBP's investment and program of monitoring the bittern population was eased back, so they stopped looking and recording nests as intensively as they did before, because bitterns were doing well. So it's just because of that effort that nowadays fewer nests are found. It's quite difficult to find bittern nests, as I'm sure you can imagine. So there's hopefully I might have persuaded you, at least in part, that what I'm going to talk about and the work of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel and the work of other monitoring programs in the UK is worthwhile, because it feeds into conservation to help the birds themselves. And just briefly to talk more widely about monitoring rather than just rare breeding birds, firstly is to point out that all of this, all of the monitoring programs for birds in the UK, which we're very lucky to have. We have a really impressive sort of network coverage of our bird populations through this. Our partnership between NGOs such as the RSBB and the British Trust for Ornithology and government conservation agencies, which have their strengths and weaknesses, but certainly do their best job in trying to support this work. So the partnership between these organisations and also between people. The vast majority of the monitoring, bird monitoring that happens in the UK, including that for rare breeding birds we'll talk about, is based on what we call citizen science. It's based on the efforts of volunteers, of individuals, maybe with more experience than these two in most cases, but people giving their free time to contribute to monitoring programs. And it's that partnership between government, NGOs, and individuals as citizen scientists which make this all possible. And just to show how this fits together, and this is for breeding birds, we have other programs such as the Wetland Bird Survey for our wintering bird populations. But for our breeding bird populations, we're lucky in the UK to have this sort of patchwork of monitoring programs. There is the Breeding Bird Survey, partnership between the BTO, RSBB, and JNCC, run by the BTO, and that produces trends. I think this graph is wrong. Actually, it should say 119 species in the latest report. Basically, the efforts of around 3,000 volunteers every year doing random 1 kilometre squares across the UK mean that we're able to produce trends tracking the populations of all of the UK's common and widespread breeding birds. This line on the vertical axis here shows the abundance of species. So all our abundant species, maybe from about 10,000 pairs upwards, right up to our commonest birds such as wren, our commonest breeding bird, with about estimated to have about 13 million pairs, the wren. So the Breeding Bird Survey enables us to track their populations, to see how they're doing, whether they're going up and down year by year. Then there's a group of species which are starting to get just too rare, too scarce to be picked up in sufficient of these scattered BBS squares to allow their populations to be monitored accurately. And there's this group of about 30 species with populations somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand, where we run special surveys for. So periodic surveys, either every 6 years or every 12 years, usually there'll be a repeat survey of them to get an idea of numbers and how they fared since the last survey. It used to be called scarabs, these surveys. They changed the name recently to the Scarce Breeding Bird Survey. So eagles, red-throated divers, and so forth. A couple of examples here with pictures. Capercaillie, so the last survey of Capercaillie estimated 582 individuals left in northern Scotland, and there have been about 5 previous surveys of Capercaillie at intervals going back into the 80s. This have allowed us to track their population, unfortunately the decline of the population through time. And then slightly commoner, turtle doves. So the first national survey of turtle doves was recently 2022, I think, if I can remember rightly, produced an estimate of just over 2,000 pairs. That was the first ever survey. Turtle doves used to be common enough and widespread enough to be monitored by the Breeding Bird Survey. It's the rapid decline of turtle doves that means that we now have to do these special surveys of them. There's been one, there'll be another quite soon, within a couple of years, that will allow the first time we've got 2 points, 2 estimates for them to track the population since that first survey. And that's how we monitor turtle doves going forward, using these scarce breeding bird surveys. And then below that band of scarce species, we have the work of the Rare Breeding Bird Panel. So we cover about 80 regular rare breeding birds in the UK. That's species with populations less than 2,000 pairs. I'll come back to what birds I'm talking about and the range of them. There's about 80 and a longer list of extremely rare ones that occasionally breed. That's our work. So between these 3 schemes, we have pretty good coverage of the UK's breeding birds. There are a few gaps, a few species that don't get picked up by these as yet. And of course, there are special efforts for things like seabird monitoring program and occasional censuses. But across these, we managed to get a really quite a good idea of how all our breeding birds are doing. And they are, as a typical example, I should have skipped to that, typical example of a rare breeding bird, right bang in the middle. And this is our logo species of black-necked grebe. On average, over the last 5 years, 61 pairs. So, it's far too rare to be picked up on by the Breeding Bird Survey. And actually, it doesn't need special surveys like the Scarce Breeding Bird surveys. We can count more or less all our black-necked grebes every year. So, Rare Breeding Birds Panel, I've mentioned it a few times without telling you what it is. It's an independent body that was formed in the early 70s. So first in 1972 and started working in 1973. It's independent from, but is funded by the RBBP and the UK government via the JNCC. That's the sort of oversight body for conservation at the UK level for the government, and some additional funding from the British Trust for Ornithology. But it's independent from them. It's a panel of experts who sit on as volunteers, but there are representatives of those three organisations. And it employs a professional secretary to basically do the work of the panel on a part-time basis. And that's my job. That's why I'm here talking to you this evening. If you're good at maths, you will have realised that we formed in 1973. We're over 50 years old. Not exactly difficult maths, but so yes, just to point out, we are long established. We sit on a lot of data through 50 years of monitoring. We have a lot of experience. Of course, we've not all been on the panel for 50 years, all of us, but yeah, we're a long established body. And in fact, if you're interested in our history and so forth, if you go to our website, there are a couple of review papers looking at what we've done over those 50 years, which you can get from our our front page. And to be honest, you don't really need to know who we are, but there are 10 of us. As I mentioned, 3, Helen Baker, Dawn Balmer, and Andy Stanbury sit as representatives of their funding organisations. But the others, and all of us, in fact, sit on the panel because we have some sort of expertise related to rare breeding birds, whether it's in particular areas, particular groups of species, such as raptors, in their conservation, in their use for the use of the data for legislative purposes, in various aspects of monitoring and field work and rigging, for example. So all the panel bring together expertise to basically steer the work of what is a monitoring program, and my work in delivering that. And what is that work, and what do we actually do? We're not like the Breeding Bird Survey, that we're a monitoring scheme that collects data and directs the work of people. And unfortunately, it's not my job to roam around the countryside in the spring and autumn, spring and summer, looking and recording rare breeding birds myself. That'd be a nice job, but it's not mine. We work to collate the data collected by others on rare breeding birds. And there's a lot of activity across the UK and people out there recording rare breeding birds for all sorts of reasons. And we work to collect that information, to be able to archive it, and to be able to report on how those species are doing using that data. We work to encourage improvements in their monitoring, so more of this monitoring effort and of better quality. And that's why I like to give talks like this, is to encourage people to help us with our work. We maintain a secure archive for conservation research purposes. So that's going back over 50 years now, and has literally hundreds of thousands of records of rare breeding birds in it. So there's an awful lot of interesting things and worthwhile things you can do with that data. We produce annual reports, as I mentioned before. We've just published one, reviewing and giving the latest updates on the status of all our rare breeding birds. And we have a website with lots of information on. So if you nod off during this talk, or your connection goes down or whatever, you can go to rbbp.org.uk at any time and find out what you missed and what I forgot to say, and so forth. Before I go any further, it would be sensible just for me to sort of emphasize how well we look after rare breeding bird data. We understand that there are, justifiable concerns about sharing information about rare and sensitive breeding birds. Not everyone wants to look after them and care for them as well as we do. And in fact, even people who do care and love rare breeding birds can act to their detriment. If people know about rare breeding birds and want to go and see them, they can disturb them, for example. We, in over 50 years, have never accidentally, inadvertently, or ill-advisedly released rare breeding bird data. So we've got a completely sort of 100% clean record of looking after the data that we provided. We make use of it. We provide it to other people within conservation sectors, for example, to use it for the conservation of birds. And we've never allowed data to end up where it shouldn't be as part of that process in 50 years. So we look after it. We're very careful with it. And those providing data to us can trust us to do so. So, as I've already said, we work by not collecting, but collating the data that other people collect in the field. So that's the likes of conservationists, those running nature reserves, those working on species recovery projects, of scientists, of what I call here specialist amateurs, so the likes of bird ringers, nest recorders, raptor study group workers, and as much as anything, bird watchers. So in terms of the data we receive annually and the various sources we receive it from conservation organizations and so forth, about 65 to 70% of the data we receive every year comes from county bird recorders who collate data from their bird watching networks, such as Tim Haywood does nowadays in Essex, collating data from your bird watching activity. That's about 2/3 of the data we receive. So bird watching activity is really the most important part of monitoring our rare breeding birds. But just some examples. So we get data on red-necked phalaropes from the RSBB's work, monitoring the species through their recovery work in Shetland and other parts of northern Scotland on their reserves and elsewhere. Really good monitoring network. So we get a data set on red-necked phalaropes from there. We get data from the British Trust for Ornithology from bird ringing of rare breeding birds and nest recording when it's rare breeding bird species, the schemes they run for that. We get a data set from the RSBB from their reserves. So their standardized monitoring across their reserve network. We get an annual contribution of that. We get data from scientists and, like I said, specialist amateurs, those working on birds of prey, for example. There's a tracking program on eagles. So a lot of valuable data from those activities. We get data from Schedule 1 license returns. So in order to undertake activity around the nests and the breeding sites of species which are listed on Schedule 1 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, so our most threatened species, you need a license from a relevant licensing body such as Natural England. And one of the conditions of that license is you submit a return of what you did and what you saw using the license. So if you're a photographer and you want to photograph a rare breeding bird near the nest, you need a license from Natural England or another relevant body wherever you are for it. And as part of that, you then have to submit a return at the end of the year saying what you did and what the birds were and where they were and how they did breeding. So there's some valuable information in those license returns, which we get as well. Finally, as I said, as much as anything, as important as anything, or indeed more important, the activity of people birdwatching, coming across rare breeding birds in the breeding season, taking the information down and submitting a record to allow that to be compiled by a county recorder and passed on to us. Right, that's what we do. That's how we work, collating that data, coming through to me, allowing us to produce reports and maintain our archive and so forth. Just to clarify what a rare breeding bird is, as I mentioned before, these are species with fewer than 2,000 pairs breeding in the UK, of which there are 80 species that breed every year, less than 2,000 pairs. At the top end, we've got the likes of avocet, which in fact nowadays is just over 2,000 pairs. We might be taking it off our list quite soon, as we have with species in the past. For example, we used to collect data on Chetty's warblers until they got too abundant to be considered a rare breeding bird. Avocet might be coming off soon. So that's at the top end. At bottom end, we've got things like purple sandpipers, where there is one breeding site in northern Scotland and there's one pair found there nearly every year. and that is it. So you can't get much rarer in terms of a regular breeding bird than purple sandpiper at some remote site. There are a range of species, in fact, a longer list. There's about 100 species which we have data on, which either have just occasionally bred in the UK or haven't even bred, but have shown signs of wanting to breed, attempting to breed, even if they haven't done successfully. So this rather fuzzy black and white picture is a spotted sandpiper. This is one of a pair of spotted sandpipers that tried to breed in the river mouth, a river mouth on the Isle of Skye in 1975. They got as far as laying 4 eggs. Unfortunately, the nest failed. It was believed it got trampled by cattle, and the sort of partly damaged eggs are still in the National Museum of Scotland. That's the only time that they've tried to breed in the UK. In fact, it's the only time that we know of that a North American wader has tried to breed in Europe. There have been the occasional single spotted sandpipers that have hybridized with common sandpipers, but it's the only time there's been an actual pair of spotted sandpipers. So there's a list of birds that have just tried every now and again. And then there are those which have never actually managed to breed. This is a great reed warbler. Of the 51 years that the Rare Breeding Bird Panel has reported on so far, we've reported singing male great reed warblers in 32 of them. So more often than not, there are great reed warblers turning up somewhere in a reed bed in the wetland, usually in southern England, establishing territories and singing, trying to attract a mate. And as far as we know, none of those great reed warblers in 32 years of trying have ever been successful in attracting a mate. You have to think that one will sooner or later, but at the moment that remains a potential breeding species. We also, I'll mention briefly, we also collect data and report upon non-native breeding species, on rare non-native breeding species, with a lower threshold of 300 pairs, so a little bit rarer. You may be aware that non-native species, alien invasives, are considered to globally be one of the greatest threats to biodiversity. They can have really adverse impacts on native wildlife. So it is sensible that we have a program that keeps an eye on what bird populations, what bird species are arriving in the UK artificially, and track their populations in case that they might be a conservation issue in the future. So we have that role. And we report on those. We don't do that annually as we do for native species, but every few years, every 6 years, we put out a report like we did a couple of years ago, summarizing how they're doing at the moment. So that was in British Birds. And revealing things like how actually we talk about non-natives invading and becoming commoner and a conservation problem, but this is an example going the other way. This is a close-up of Lady Amherst pheasant, species quite close to my heart because I grew up on the Buckinghamshire-Bedfordshire border, which was their stronghold once upon a time. So when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there was a population of a couple of hundred males. You can see this graph, how by the sort of mid-90s that had halved, and then a decline. There was a bit of a gap in monitoring at the end of the century, but you can see by the early years of this century, there were little more than a dozen males, possibly a dozen females. We didn't know. The males are a lot easier to find, and then eventually the population faded out, and there was one male left for a couple of years at the site, which was quite popular, with birdwatchers rushing to try and get it on their list before that disappeared in May 2016. So we tracked the disappearance of a non-native species rather than the more common pattern of growing populations. Right. I'll now talk about native species, and I will call upon our new report. As I say, this was published on Tuesday. I would say it's hot off the press, but it was published online, and the hard copies of the journal British Birds is published in haven't even come off the press yet. They'll be hitting doormats in a couple of weeks' time. So it's even before being hot off the press. I'm going to talk through some of the patterns, some of the news from this new report. I think this is a lovely cover of British Birds this month, but I should clarify, because we have been asked online, and your bird watchers, you'll understand, this is not artificial intelligence gone mad. This is not one of these crazy AI pictures where people have 8 fingers and so forth. Yes, there are more legs than you would expect, but this is a little ring plover sheltering its young under its plumage, under its wings, its breast feathers, as they sometimes do during rain and when there's predators around. So it is not, as we've been accused of, as an artificially derived picture. It is nature doing what nature does. So we're talking about 2023, and it's now late 2025. The reporting, the collation of data, the flow of data from all those sources I talked about before into me, and then the analysis of that and production of the report takes time. So some of this is, there is a considerable time lag of 2 years in our reporting. So just remember that. 2023, there are a couple of exciting events in our rare breeding birds. A couple of species returning to breed for the first time in a number of years. One of which was hoopoe. So a pair of hoopoes raised 3 young in a bit of farmland in Leicestershire. So a complete surprise out of the blue. That's the first breeding in the UK since 1996, so a considerable gap. Going back almost 200 years, there are records of hoopoe, regular records of hoopoe breeding in the UK. So quite a gap from 96, when there was a pair bred successfully in Montgomeryshire in Wales, to the return in 2023. It's not particularly clear, but if you can see this clearly enough, there's one bird on the fence rail at the top, and in fact all the other 4, so this is both adults and all 3 young, are along the grass at the bottom. There's one hiding behind the post just in front of the blue bag, you can just about see. So we've got the family of 5 all in this one sort of quite unique picture. So that was an exciting return. Another species which returned as a breeder into 2023 was Temming stint. Now, Temming stint was an extremely rare but regular breeder in remote parts of northern Scotland for several decades. I'll go to the next graph. You can see from the early 70s, every year there were Temming stints at these breeding sites, and those dark bars show the years where breeding was confirmed. We know birds nested. They probably did in most of those years, but it can be hard to prove that. So regular breeding until 1997, and then they fizzled out and they stopped returning to these few sites they bred at, and they ceased to be a breeding bird. In 2021, birds started returning, in fact, to one of the sites where they bred at decades before. So obviously the habitat was still suitable at that site. A couple of years we thought they probably were breeding, but didn't manage to prove it. In 2023, field workers working under the correct licenses from Nature Scott, and they were able to find a nest with 4 eggs and protect the site. Unfortunately, it's a site with fluctuating water levels. There were floods shortly after, and the nest was flooded out. So they didn't breed successfully, but we know with laying eggs that they tried to breed. So a species, again, another species that returned after decades of absence. In terms of infrequent breeders, we also saw 2 breeding attempts by bee-eaters in 2023. That's the first time that bee-eaters have tried to breed in more than one location in the same year. I'm sure many of you will be aware, and in fact, some of you may have visited Trimmingham in Norfolk, where bee-eaters bred in 2022. They bred successfully. In 23, they returned, and a pair did try to breed. Unfortunately, they failed, which may be due to nest predation by a stoat. It's not completely clear. And the same year, a pair turned up at a site in Greater Manchester and tried to breed. Unfortunately, they also failed and abandoned the nest, probably due to the weather. But still, first time that there's been attempted breeding at 2 sites. And in terms of returning, this is maybe slightly less glamorous, but yellow-legged gulls. So another southern species that was a regular, if extremely rare breeder in southern UK from the 1980s, 1990s onwards. But in 2019, there was then a gap, 3 years with no breeding activity. In 2023, there was the first breeding record since 2019, where pair breeding in Staffordshire successfully, as well as another bird paired with a herring gull. Most gulls like to hybridize a yellow-legged gull, paired with a herring gull in Cornwall. So a return of another species previously absent. As well as these returning species, this latest report shows 15 species hitting record totals. So there are quite a lot of our rare breeding birds doing well in the UK and increasing, some of them year after year, just increasing in numbers. 15 of these species hit record totals, 2023. So wetland birds did quite well. So shoveler, for example, this is one of these less scarce species, really. We talk about rare breeding birds. Some of the birds we monitor, you wouldn't necessarily think of as really rare, but scarce. So there's about 1,500 breeding pairs of shoveler in the UK. So they're towards our upper level of 2,000. And you can see over the last 20 years how there's been a steady increase in the numbers of shoveler reported. There may be partly an effect of improved coverage and improved reporting. We added this species to our list that we cover in 2006, and it may be in the first few years it took a while for everyone to realise that we wanted their records of shoveler and start reporting them. So there might be a slight artifact, but it does appear in recent years there has been still an upturn in shoveler. Another duck. Oh, and we can also, about this slide, we can also map distribution of all the species that we work on. We won't necessarily share maps of all of them because of the sensitivity of the species, but shoveler, you can see this is a pretty widespread species across England up into Scotland, not so common in the west of the country other than the Outer Hebrides. Quite a concentration in parts of East Anglia and along the East Anglian coast down into Essex. I mean, there's good populations of shoveler in Essex. You're an important county for the species. Another duck that's doing well and hit record numbers in 2023 is pochard. You can see a steady increase since we started collecting data on pochard in 1996. This is quite a surprise, quite a puzzle, in fact. Internationally, globally, pochard are a threatened species. They're listed as vulnerable on the World Conservation Union's global red list. Yeah, they're on the same list as pandas are for concern about their global population. We know the population across Europe and into breeding grounds in Russia has declined, the breeding population. And we know as a consequence of that numbers coming to winter in the UK have declined dramatically over recent decades. So real concern for how pochards are doing. But as a breeding species in the UK, well, they're still rare. It's still a drop in the ocean compared to the populations in Europe. But our breeding population has steadily increased, well over doubled, heading towards tripled in recent decades. You don't really understand why that is. We know they're mainly in England. This splits that graph down into the countries. You can see the sort of amber yellow line just below the dark line at the top is how the English population is doing, and they're mostly in England and they're steadily increasing. Essex again is an important county. In fact, Essex in the last report, which I checked earlier today, is the second most important county for pochard in the UK. It's only Kent had a larger breeding population in 2023. You'll notice, by the way, a dip in the graph near the end. Some of our graphs have this dip. Some of them just have a gap in the data. That is 2020, when, if you cast your mind back, we had COVID and we didn't do as much bird watching and recording as we normally would do. So that impacted our reporting for many species in that year. And you can see that in the graphs. So it's not a genuine decline and genuine dip to be worried about. As well as our ducks and black-necked grebe is another species hitting a record total, a number of large wading birds are doing well. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with this. You'll be aware of how 20, 30 years ago, you'd have been lucky to see a little egret on a day's out birding. In fact, the first little egret I ever saw was in at East Tilbury in the late 80s, and it was very exciting, and I travelled a considerable distance to see it, which of course you wouldn't travel a considerable distance to see a little egret nowadays, and you probably wouldn't for a great white egret. So in 2023 there were over 100 pairs of great white egrets in the UK. Cattle egrets also increasing. This graph I'll need to explain a little bit. This shows the population trends of the three egret species, cattle, great white, and little, in their first few years of colonization, which of course started in different years. So year 0 for those species, these three species, is a different year. So for little egret, the blue dashed line shows the increase from 1996 onwards, and you can see by how into the early years of the first decade of the century, numbers have risen to 700 pairs within 10 years of breeding started. The red line is cattle egret, so the start year for there is 2017 when they first started breeding. They had bred in the UK once or twice earlier, but that's when the sort of concerted recent colonization started. And you can see actually for the first 4 years, sort of fascinatingly, for the first 4 years of that colonization, they exactly tracked the numbers that little egrets had reached a couple of decades previously. They've dropped off slightly over the last couple of years, 6 years since 2017, so that's up to 2023. But still, I anticipate that red line will turn up. And they've reached, as you probably all know, they've reached Essex in this time. And then that yellowy amber line is the population trend of great white egret since first breeding in 2012, a slower increase, but a steady increase. It only looks like a slow increase actually because it's on the same graph as little egret. And within 11 years of the first breeding, there are now over 100 pairs, 110 pairs we reported for 2023, and we know they're expanding all the time. We know, for example, that this year they reached Anglesey and bred on Anglesey for the first time. So population expanding and growing all the time. Another species that's doing well, I'm just going to stop for a minute and you can watch the graph and watch a spoonbill while I have a quick drink. There you are. I thought I'd pop that. I did that for our social media this morning and I would pop it into today's talk and it seems to have worked okay. So that's good. You can see how spoonbills colonized Holcombe, well-known breeding colony on the Norfolk coast around the turn of the century, and the population there steadily grew. And then in recent years, we've seen a rather sharper upturn, both through increases in numbers at Holcombe, but then spreading to new sites, including into Essex. So another species that is expanding and increasing. Yet another species, a seabird, doing well, doing extremely well, is Mediterranean gull. Gorgeous species, a remarkable growth in recent years. It was a breeding species. It was a rare breeding bird species when the panel started its work in the early 70s. There were birds around then, and it remained an extremely rare species for about 30 years, just at a few sites, slow growth in a colony on the south coast in Hampshire. And then again, around the turn of the century, we see this sudden increase. Some fluctuations due to disturbance at main breeding colonies, to the effects of high spring tides, flooding colonies out. But under that sort of fluctuation, that red dotted line shows the running mean through that. And we can see how the population has shot up. And in fact, in 2023, our most recent year of reporting, there were over 3,400 pairs. So it is ceased really to be a rare breeding bird. We should be taking it off the list of species we monitor. We are just being slightly cautious, and I will mention this in a minute regards other species, about the potential impact of bird flu on Mediterranean gull. We know that there have been quite considerable mortality in some populations of Mediterranean gull in 2023. So there is the potential for that upward trend being reversed by bird flu. So we're just taking a sort of slightly cautious approach to removing it from the species we monitor. Another species expanding and increasing in the UK, black-winged stilts. 2023 was the 10th year in succession that black-winged stilts had tried to breed in the UK, and there were 9 breeding pairs, which is more than ever before across a range of sites as far north as Yorkshire. So a species that has become a regular, though still really rare, a regular breeding species in the UK. Of course, you'll detect, I talked about quail earlier and the northward shift of quail within the UK. You'll be aware that the spread of many of these species is at least in part driven by climate change. So we're seeing that northward expansion of species from southern Europe, such as black-winged stilt. But we shouldn't overlook, for many of these species, the fact that improved conservation, both across Europe to help populations recover there, and in the UK to provide great wetland sites, great habitat for them to expand into, is also playing an important role in the increase of some of these species. And it's not just all down to climate change. Our raptors are, by and large, although there was bad news about Montague's harrier before, our raptors are by and large doing well, and there are a number of species increasing more or less year after year. So we reported 316 pairs of osprey in 2023. You can see the trend there. You can see how when the panel started in the early 70s, it was a species still just very much on the edge, just starting to sort of expand, having returned to the UK as a breeding species in the 1950s because it had been extinct for decades. So we can see that the steady increase from there, some fluctuations over the years. Again, that gap in the line is caused by COVID, but increasing numbers to over 300 pairs. And with that has come an expansion. So a move into northern England, an assisted move down to Rutland through reintroduction there and on the south coast in Dorset, and a natural return to Wales as well, and increasing numbers in Wales. 2023 was an auspicious year because they returned as a breeding species to Northern Ireland. So there was a breeding pair successfully bred in County Fermanagh. In fact, that was the first breeding record in the whole of Ireland, in the island of Ireland, for over 200 years. So ospreys are doing well. Marsh harriers are doing well. Again, this is a species which was virtually extinct when the rare breeding bird panel started in the early 70s. Very, very few birds left, and we can see the recovery of that population to now over 500 pairs. It was the first time this year, 2023, that we reported over 500 pairs in the UK. So a fantastic recovery, greater protection, greater habitat provision, species that's really flourishing, and an expansion in that species as well, now breeding as far north as northern Scotland. So yeah, great to see that, and a variety of other raptor species doing well. We know, white-tailed eagles, goshawks, flourishing. In fact, I almost forgot I got a slide of goshawks in the talk. A fantastic photo. I'll just skip to the graph of goshawks. Although there was a slight downturn in this last year, not sure what's driven that, although possibly an impact of a lot of habitat loss from Storm Arwen early in 2022, and the subsequent clearance, the forestry clearance of areas damaged by Storm Arwen the following year. This talk is coming to you from Northumberland, and that was an incredible storm up here, and there was miles upon miles and many millions of tons of forestry felled across northern England and northern Scotland, some of it in the heart of the goshawk distribution. So that might be that impact feeding through the loss of nest sites. And in some cases, quite possibly not a loss of breeding birds, but breeding birds moving to new sites where the raptor field workers who record the goshawks didn't manage to find them in time in that breeding season. So birds shifting from traditional sites to new places where they weren't found. Anyway, you can see that increase in goshawk numbers to, now well over 1,000 pairs, and probably quite considerably more. So we know that we underreport goshawks as it is. They're not all found. But good news for goshawks. There's also, and I like this talk, I'm giving an optimistic talk this evening. It's not all optimistic, but lots of good news about our rare breeding birds. We've talked about birds recovering. We've talked about birds increasing, possibly driven by climate change in southern England. The flip side to that is species of northern UK which we might expect to be suffering from the impacts of climate change. Those species which breed at higher altitudes, those species of Arctic and Scandinavian breeding areas, which we would expect to be retreating from the UK in the advance of climate change. And I've no doubt that will happen. But for some of those species, such as Temming stint, we talked about having returned as a breeder, and wood sandpiper, which is this wader here, are doing well. And this is really quite a surprise, quite a sort of one we're not particularly sure how we explain this, how we understand this increase. Wood sandpiper, green sandpiper, red-necked phalarope, all high latitude northern breeding species of wader, are doing well in the UK, and you can see in the case of wood sandpiper extremely well. The blue line shows the number of pairs, the green dotted line, that running mean, and the red bars are the number of sites, showing that the recent dramatic increase in wood sandpipers isn't just through an expansion at known sites. They're spreading in range. They're being found in more places all the time. They're moving a bit further south in Scotland, being found in Argyll for the first time, doing really well. A 61% increase between 22 and 23, and indeed a tripling of numbers over the last 10 years. So a little bit hard to explain. We don't quite understand why this is happening. The modelling based on climate change suggests trends should be going the other way, but at the moment they aren't. So there's a few species showing very clear upward trends. Good news, conservation success in many cases. There are, of course, a whole range of species which are just fluctuating up and down. We don't see the clear patterns of change. A couple, two favourites of mine I'm going to show now, long-eared and short-eared owls. You can see the population trends for these. We know for both species that we're not counting all of the birds, that the large chunks of the population are unreported to us, particularly for long-eared owl. It's very difficult to find, very cryptic, hard to find species with large populations in areas with very low human density and thus low birdwatching effort. So although this graph shows between 300 and 400 pairs of long-eared owls, we think the true population is maybe 4 or 5 times larger than that. This is quite interesting, though, despite these caveats, these concerns about how good our reporting of these two species are, we can see how they track each other, how there's synchrony between long and short-eared owl population fluctuations. And we know why this is. Both species are particularly partial to short-tailed field voles throughout the year, but they're an important part of the breeding diet. And many of you have probably heard of vole cycles. Our populations of field voles go up and down between years in the way that lemmings do and other northern species of rodent. And so the populations of those species that feed on them, like these two owl species, fluctuate up and down in response to the vole populations. So we can see that both owls are going up and down in synchrony. 2023 was quite a good vole year across the UK as a whole, and we can see that how both owl species had a relatively good year in terms of numbers reported. Another fluctuating species, one that you'll find in small numbers in Essex, is the black redstart. And we can see a sort of longer term pattern in black redstart numbers. You can see how it was a species that the panel collected data on in the early 1970s. Then around 1977, they decided it was too common and they'd take it off the list. So they didn't collect data. That's why there's that gap until the mid-80s on the graph there. Then it was added back on as over the years, the remit of the panel expanded to include less scarce species. They brought on these more common rare breeders over time. And we can see at that point through the 80s and 90s into the first part of the century, the population dropped quite markedly. In fact, around the first decade of the century, thinking of those birds of conservation concern assessments I mentioned much earlier on, it went onto the red list as a bird of high conservation concern. We can see that since that point, actually, there's been a steady increase. So the numbers do tend to fluctuate up and down between years. So at the moment, black redstarts seem to be doing quite well. Around 85 territories reported every year nowadays. Another species that's shown these longer patterns is a considerably rarer species nowadays, is the marsh warbler. Marsh warblers used to have a population established in Hereford and Worcestershire, migrant species, but they return to the West Midlands every year and breed in some numbers. But through the 70s and 80s, that population crashed and eventually disappeared. In the early 90s, for a few years, they seemed to be establishing a breeding population in southeast England, in Kent in particular, and then that disappeared. And we've got to the point over the last 20 years where we have very few breeding marsh warblers in the UK. And indeed, the numbers that we get in any year are principally seem to be determined by the weather conditions on their migration. So there are late migrants, late May, early June. And if at that point when they're migrating up to Scandinavia, we have a period of easterly winds, we tend to get more marsh warblers, such as in, I think it's 2020 there on the graph, that peak a couple of years back. Easterly winds at the right point during migration just drift some birds across the North Sea, and they establish up the east coast. The breeding records in recent years from Kent right up to Shetland, and we get singing males that sometimes manage to attract a female, and they breed along the east coast. And that's all we get nowadays. There's no established regular breeding sites, just these birds which happen to turn up depending on how the wind has been. This is a bird close to my heart. As I said before, I'm up in Northumberland. Nearly all of the UK's breeding roseate terns are on the RBBP reserve at Coquet Island, which is about 7 or 8 miles from where I'm sitting in Alnwick. Beautiful species. If you've not been up to Northumberland to see them, I thoroughly recommend that you do. And a species that's been doing well. There's a big crash in the breeding population in the 1980s, a problem of persecution on the wintering grounds in West Africa, also a mass movement of many of the British breeding population to the Republic of Ireland. They were just shifted within a small period of years to mainly to Rockabill population down in the Republic. So we lost many of our roseate terns. Conservation work since, centred on the colony at Coquet, has allowed a steady recovery over the last 20 years. Some fluctuations, but numbers over the last decade going up nearly every year. I've said this is largely a good news story, but not so good news story at the end of this graph. So in 2022, the population on Coquet Island was hit quite heavily by bird flu, so highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI. We know that in 22, that at least 90 adults died and 170 chicks died on the breeding colony. So subsequently, in 2023, there was a substantial drop in breeding numbers. The UK population fell from 159 pairs to 122. In 2023, only 4 adults died of bird flu. So there seemed to be some immunity developing. Unfortunately, there was still quite a chick die-off, 73 chicks. So still a bit of a problem there. We know that at least in 24, the productivity, the breeding success was nearly as high as it's ever been. So there are signs that they're beginning to prosper again and bounce back, and there haven't been any further outbreaks within this species. So touch wood, we'll see a recovery to previous numbers, and then hopefully that line will keep going up beyond them. But bird flu is a concern. We know that there have been impacts on eagles. I mentioned Mediterranean gulls before, and there seems to be an impact on peregrines. For many species, particularly those that aren't colonial, where die-offs, deaths are very obvious, it can be hard to detect impacts. Certainly, there's quite a bit of anecdotal evidence of deaths of peregrine chicks, and in some cases adults. But there seems to be sort of quite a signal within our data. So in 2023, the numbers of peregrines reported were about 18% down on the year before. So that's the largest between-year decline we've ever picked up in peregrines. It was widespread. We know that in 53 counties, there was a decline in peregrine numbers from 2022 to 2023. There were only, I think, about a dozen counties where there was an increase. So it seems to be a widespread decline in peregrine numbers. We also know there's evidence from some areas of poor breeding success in 2022. We know there's things like recruitment of young birds into breeding pairs. So normally subadult peregrines don't breed. they wait to mature. But in 2023, there were quite a considerable proportion of breeding pairs in some areas had young birds in, which suggests that the adult birds had died, giving them an opportunity to recruit. So some concern there. And while I'm doing the bad news, there is a bit, of course, there is, it can't all be good news. Slavonian grebes, one of our most attractive rare breeding birds, I think. Hopefully you agree looking at this photo. And a species with very good monitoring. In fact, before the RBBP started its work in 1973, going back into the 60s and 70s, 60s and 50s, there's good monitoring data on Slavonian grebe collected by volunteers in Scotland. We can see this decline going back to the 90s, from about 70 pairs at its 70, 80 pairs at its peak. In 2023, there were only 16 pairs in northern Scotland. That's the lowest that has ever been reported. And this is a species that's struggling globally. So it's larger populations in Iceland, in Northern America, in Scandinavia are also declining. And this is a species that does seem to be feeling the adverse impact of climate change, unfortunately. Redwing, another northern species, unlike these waders I talked about before, which seem to be doing well. Redwing, another species of northern latitudes, which is declining. Only 6 pairs found in 2023. That's a joint lowest. Not if you ignore the dip in 2020 when no one was allowed outside in Scotland for months on end during the COVID year. So yeah, bad news for Redwing. Again, that seems to mirror a wider pattern, certainly across Scandinavia, possibly into Russia as well, of declines in breeding populations. And of course, there are some species which rarely feature in RBBP reports nowadays. There were no redback shrikes or fieldfares in the 2023 report. The species had been regular breeders in the past. In fact, redback shrike was once a common and widespread breeding species. And golden oriole. So there's a graph of golden orioles, never common, but once with well-established breeding populations in East Anglia and the fenlands of East Anglia, mainly in poplar plantations, but now haven't been confirmed breeding since 2009, when the last pair was found at the RBBP's reserve at Lakenheath. Since then, all we've had are small numbers of singing males establishing territories and failing to attract mates. So a lost species. We have, of course, seen before, such as Temming stint, how lost species can come back. So there is hope that golden oriole may return. As well as these patterns in regular breeders, part of our 80 species, every year we report on a scatter of oddities of lost birds attempting to breed. And 2023 was no different. So just 3 examples here. This is ring-billed gull, which is returned to a common gull colony in Scotland every year for 15 years. Well, 15 years up to 2023, and I know it's still coming back, so 17 years now. And it tries to form a pair with common gulls. It tends to largely just fly around pestering them and being very unpopular. But we do know there have been occasions when it has managed to attract a mate and eggs have been laid. As far as we're aware, it's not managed to breed successfully and raise hybrid young, although we do know that there is a bird in Ireland that's managed to. So there's still possibly hope for this to raise offspring. Just a lost bird in a Scottish common gull colony. This is another lost bird. This is an American black tern, which returns to the Northumberland coast, not far from me. It's still coming back. It was back in 2025 for its 6th year in a row. And in fact, we've not reported on this year, but next year's report will cover how in 2024 it managed to attract a mate from the Arctic terns, amidst which it spends the summer amongst. So first time in history recorded breeding attempt of Arctic tern and black tern. The black tern is a female. It did lay eggs, so hybrid eggs, although they failed to hatch, and it's probably unlikely that 2 such unrelated birds, different genus as American black tern and Arctic tern, would be able to raise viable eggs. So unlikely, but they tried. So remarkable breeding attempt. And as there have been many years recently, there was 1 singing male Blythe's reed warbler in 2023, no more than that. But we do know that in 2024, So again, that'll be in next year's report. They bred successfully for the first time in the UK. One of a sort of a regular series of recent years of new breeding birds. So in 2022, Glossy ibis bred for the first time in the UK, 2024, Bly's reed warbler, and not that far up the coast from you in 2025. And some of you may have been up to Suffolk to see the Zitting cisticolas that bred in the UK for the first time. So we're seeing a regular flow of new breeding birds coming into the UK. Right, that was the interesting bit about rare breeding birds and what we know about them and what our report says. We've now got on to the last bit of the talk where I pester you a bit and try and encourage you to help us with our work in recording rare breeding birds. Because as I said before, birdwatchers and birdwatching activity are the mainstay of what we do. That's where most of our data comes from. And I've talked about trends. I've shown all this species is doing that, and this is going up, and this is going down, and so forth, with a degree of certainty. But actually, for many of the species we collect data on, many species below our 2,000 pair threshold, we don't know too well how they're doing. We don't receive enough data on their populations to be able to track them with any certainty. Some cases, they will give us an idea of how species are doing. In other cases, we're really only receiving data from a fraction of the population, and we can't draw many inferences from it. So this graph has just some of the species, this slide has just some of the species for which our data is less than perfect, and for which we are uncertain of how populations are doing. If you read through these, you might sort of detect some patterns. Many of these species are of northern areas and remote upland areas where there's low bird watching activity, fewer people, fewer bird watchers, hard to reach. Some of these are difficult to find species, honey buzzards, hobbies, the owl species, cryptic, nocturnal in some cases, shy species where it's just hard to detect, hawfinch, lesser spotted woodpeckers will be the other examples. And some of them are species which actually in some areas can be quite commonplace, and so they exceed the ability and sometimes the interest of local birdwatchers to monitor them. So hawfinch are a very scarce species, but if you go down to the New Forest, there are really quite hundreds of pairs, and there are too many that they can be monitored. Same with, say, soul buntings in Devon. So we have these various issues with these species, and we need more data. And so we do outreach, and this is part of that outreach, trying to persuade the birdwatchers of Essex to help us with some of these species. So looking at our latest report for 2023, these are the rare breeding birds which were present breeding or attempting to breed within Essex. So these are, for your county, the sort of species that we're interested in. You might not get all of these species every year. You're not necessarily going to get black-winged stilt breeding in Essex every year. And some years you may have species which aren't on this list. But this is the core species that we would be interested in data for from Essex. I'll just linger on that for a minute to let you look through that. So if you see any of these species in situations which indicates they might be breeding in the spring and summer in Essex, we want you to record what you're seeing and submit that record to help us with our monitoring. So, firstly, remember the rare breeding bird panel. Remember this bloke who talked to you in November who was interested in sightings of rare breeding birds, and they're of value and they feed into conservation work like I talked about at the beginning of the talk. So be aware of our work. Think about rare breeding birds. And if you see any of those species or something rare that's not on those species, think, someone wants to know about that. So a pair of shovelers on an Essex wetland in late May, in fact, even early in May, may be breeding birds. Don't just think, they're shovelers, they're nice. Think, I need to make a note. I need to submit a record of that. Better still, make more effort. Watch birds, work out what they're doing, possibly return to sites. If you find a pair of shovelers in May, go back in June, see whether, in fact, you might go back in June, and this often happens, people go back in June and they see one shoveler, just a male, and they think, wasn't a pair after all, the female's gone. Chances are the female hasn't gone. The female is sitting on eggs somewhere well hidden, or even has young already hatched and is hiding in some reeds, in some emergent vegetation, still there. See if you can see that bird, or go back in June, July, possibly find female bird accompanied by larger young, possibly fledged young, but looking like they still come from that site. Follow up sightings, try and improve your knowledge of breeding attempts where you first detected them. And as I said, submit quality records. And by that, I mean, if you see rare breeding birds, we want to know when, what dates. That's important information to allow us to interpret what they were doing. Numbers, of course. Nothing more frustrating than being told there were a shoveler or there were shovelers at a marsh, but not knowing how many and not knowing how many pairs. So numbers and what that meant in terms of pairs. Don't say there were 4 shovelers. Say there were 2 males and 2 females, or even better, there were a male and a female together and another male and female together, 2 pairs. Location information, so precise information. We love grid references. Very valuable. I talked about work on special protection areas before. Our ability to know what areas are good for birds and whether they're still good for birds is dependent on knowing exactly where the birds were. And so grid references to allow us to do that, very important, but at least a good site name. And breeding evidence. So the assessment of rare breeding bird records very much relies on information about what the birds were doing, using the sort of possible, probable, and confirmed categories that breeding bird atlases use, and you might be familiar from that. So submitting evidence when you see rare breeding birds about what they were doing. Was it simply a bird in breeding habitat? A bird in suitable breeding habitat in the breeding season is a breeding record. If you find a gargany in a suitable wetland in June, that could be possible breeding. It should be counted as a possible breeding record. Or a singing male is also an indication of possible breeding. If you find more exciting activity, a pair, a bird holding a territory throughout the breeding season, display, birds possibly visiting a nest site or carrying nest material, alarming in a way that might suggest they've got a nest. Those are all sort of evidence of probable breeding, and records should be submitted as probable breeding along with the information about what was happening, what the birds were doing in those categories. And then finally, any confirmed breeding record is a pair getting as far as laying eggs. You don't have to be successful as a breeding bird to be considered a confirmed breeding. It's laying eggs. So finding eggshells, finding a nest, seeing birds moving to and back and forward from a nest, indicating there are either eggs or young in there. Because of course, if you find young, there had to have been eggs. Or finding recently fledged young that were likely to have come from that site. You have to be careful about finding fledged young which might have flown from elsewhere, have they bred at the site. But if they look like they're young enough to have come from the site, obviously like these purple sandpipers, this is the one breeding pair of purple sandpipers I talked about earlier in the talk with there's an adult on the out of focus on the rock and 2 young behind them. This is at the one site in northern Scotland. If you find that is obviously confirmed breeding. So we want information on that with the data you submit. So, and it's very simple. I talked about the network of county bird recorders. We don't ask people to submit information on rare breeding birds directly to us. We ask them to submit them into their bird recording network, so to their local bird club. So for you submit them to the Essex Birdwatching Society, to the recorder, Tim Hayward. I know you have an online submission format, or you can submit them via BirdTrack. So send data in with this sort of information. That will allow Tim to collate that data, to analyze all the records he receives together. There might be multiple records of the same birds, but yours might be unique, might be the only person to have seen a particular species at a particular site. And he can then pass that on to the Rare Breeding Bird Panel in his annual submission to us. Please remember wildlife legislation, so you can break the law by disturbing rare breeding birds, and also the Birdwatchers Code of Conduct. Basically, put the welfare of breeding birds first. Yes, we want you to collect information, but no, we don't want you to disturb rare breeding birds in the process of doing so, at least especially if you're not licensed to do so, and you'll be breaking the law. Also be discreet, especially in these days of social media and WhatsApp groups and so forth, being able to share information and being excited about finding exciting rare breeding birds. But think before you share the information. In sharing information with a wider group, could harm come to the birds, whether that's someone deliberately wanting to do them harm, which is maybe unlikely, or through the impacts of disturbance. And we know that the impacts of people wanting to see birds, wanting to get photographs of birds, can disturb sensitive breeding pairs. So think very carefully about how you share news. Submit records, of course, which won't be shared widely. But yeah, just be careful. And also, I would encourage people, if you're persuaded by any of this, to go a bit further, to go and look for rare breeding birds, to put effort into, especially to find them. Take on a local study. There will be gaps in knowledge. There will be species in Essex which are under-recorded. Turtle doves, lesser spotted woodpeckers, little ringed plovers. One of my favourites, long-eared owls, very difficult to find, but I'm almost certain there will be pairs of long-eared owls in Essex which are not found. We get records from particularly the south end of the county, in areas of brownfield and areas of scrub, where these birds can often be found breeding, sometimes in quite surprisingly urban areas. Difficult to find, but very rewarding if you do. This is from my own activity. So this is a map of Northumberland. I live in Alnwick, in the middle, just below the middle of the map there. And this is stuck on my office wall in 2020 during COVID year, when we weren't allowed to drive places, and I took to cycling around in the evenings and nights around Alnwick looking for long-eared owls. I don't know whether you remember, but certainly up here it was a beautiful spring, lovely weather, nice to be cycling around. And over the course of those trips out, within 10 kilometres of Alnwick, I found 22 broods of long-eared owls. Prior to that, an average year in Northumberland, there'd be about 5 to 10 broods found in the whole county. So just shows how a bit of effort and going out and looking for one particular species can really change knowledge, and was incredibly exciting. My wife's a teacher, so every time I found a new pair, I got to come home and steal one of her merit stickers, stick it on my map, and admire this on the wall. Very rewarding. So I would encourage all of you to go out and try and find new rare breeding birds. It's good fun, and of course it helps our monitoring. I'm just going to pause again. This is the same slide as before. I'm going to take a sip of my drink while you read that and memorize. Species. Brownfield and industrial sites, gravel extraction sites, and so forth. Little ringed plovers, often like those. They're quite ephemeral. They can move between sites from year to year, often when there's new development, for example, new gravel extraction, they'll move on to them. They can be difficult sites to access sometimes, active gravel workings. But I think most counties have probably got undiscovered little ringed plovers in those sorts of sites. Turtle doves, obviously, spread across the hinterland of Essex in farmland. Lesser spotted woodpeckers, undiscovered in scattered woodlands. Long-eared owls we've talked about before. Hobbies, quite a difficult species to find until late in the summer, when young are more vocal and active, floating from nests. Possibly quite widespread, again, in sort of the interior of Essex. All species that you could find more of. And finally, if that's not enough for you, I would encourage people to remember our work when they're away on holiday. And I don't mean if you're in Ibiza, but if you go away birdwatching in the spring and summer in the UK, and if you're a birdwatcher and you're looking for interesting birds, you are very likely to come across rare breeding birds. So please remember the rare breeding bird panel. Remember, for example, our shortfalls, our gaps in our knowledge from northern Scotland. If you're lucky enough to have a Scottish birdwatching holiday, make sure that you submit data from it. So if you're in some remote Scottish loch and there's a greenshank calling, which there are across a lot of northern Scotland, but very underreported, please think, that bloke, I've forgotten his name, but the bloke from the Rare Breeding Bird panel who gave the Bird Club talk, he wanted greenshank records. I'll submit that. You submit that to the local bird recorder wherever you are. So the Highland Bird Recorder, for example, John Poyner, will want your greenshank records to include in his data submission to the Rare Breeding Bird panel. And the easiest way to do that is to use an online portal. eBird, bird recorders do use eBird, and I know that there might be some in the audience using it. BirdTrack is the other way. I'm a BirdTrack user myself. All bird recorders through the UK extract data from BirdTrack. So wherever you're going, you submit data into BirdTrack. It's secure. It hides sensitive records of rare breeding birds, so they're not publicly visible, so the birds are safe. And it enables you to submit all the information, the breeding codes, the numbers, the dates, the exact location, sort of stuff I want to know. You can submit into BirdTrack, and it makes your birdwatching sightings wherever you are available to help conservation. So there you are. That's the sort of advertorial part of this talk. Please submit all breeding records of rare breeding bird panel species to the county bird recorder wherever you are. Make sure they're good records with breeding evidence and location and all that sort of stuff. There's our website where you can find out more. Our X account, our Blue Sky account, our latest reports, and all our reports are published in British Birds. All our previous reports are available as downloads on our website, so it's all there for you to see. And it's getting on Friday evening, and you've probably got sort of other things to do, if not just go to bed. So I'm going to stop and thank you for your time and listening to me this evening.
Mark, thank you very much. That was fantastic. And it really underlines the importance of accurate records, evidence in what we're seeing out there. So yeah, thanks very much.
Pleasure.
We've got a few questions. I think some of you may have covered already when you were wrapping up. But one of our viewers has asked if the sightings are recorded on BirdTrack, is that sufficient in itself?
It should be. Yes. I mean, it's certainly. I know that in Essex they're used, and elsewhere in the UK, I think nearly all bird recorders use BirdTrack. Just the important thing is to use BirdTrack properly. So you, for example, where you can enter breeding evidence codes to say that there was a singing male, or there was a territory, or there was a nest with eggs and so forth, please do. Use precise locations, make sure your counts are correct, add the details to say that these two pairs were a pair, or they were two males and so forth. That really makes a difference to just saying this was present, or the bare minimum. So yeah, good records. BirdTrack's a great way to record them.
Brilliant, thank you very much. The next question was yeah, we talked about BirdTrack, but is that exactly the same with eBird as well?
Yes. I'm less familiar with, because I'm not an eBird user myself, but it is growing in popularity, particularly in some areas. So the same issues around making sure that records are good, that you can submit breeding evidence and so forth. They use the same standard evidence codes as BirdTrack. These are standardized. So yeah, they are. There are still some slight concerns with eBird over how it deals with the sensitivity of some species records. So they're not quite as cautious as BirdTrack in hiding data from the wider public. But you are able to hide data yourself in both BirdTrack and eBird, I believe. So if you're concerned about finding something and don't want it visible to the wider public, you can tick a box yourself to make sure that doesn't happen, I think.
That's useful. Yeah, thank you. I've got a few more questions coming through. So how often do species get taken off of the RBBP list because the numbers have increased, and then get added again as numbers come down again? And this has happened recently, excluding bird flu as an issue.
We've done it once with woodlark.
Okay.
So we took woodlark off on the back of a national survey, one of these scarce species surveys, which I talked about, which suggested the population was 3,000 or something, I think. So sort of well in excess. So we took it off. And then there were concerns raised about declines in some areas in the Brex and various other breeding areas. So we added it back on, and we still are monitoring it now. There was a heathland bird survey this year. Nightjar, Dartford Water, and woodlark was surveyed, and so we'll get a new population estimate and decide whether we take it off. But we've sort of been burnt once before because of that. So
Yeah,
we are quite cautious about
cautious,
it. We were
absolutely.
cautious about taking Chetty's warbler off
Hmm.
because we knew that in the past had been hard winters and the population had crashed of Chetty's warbler, but it sort of reached a point where it was clear. Um, yes, it was well in excess of our threshold and seemed to be holding steady despite occasional hard winters. So we took it off. Firecrest, Gadwall, water rail, red kite. I think trying to remember if there's anything else are the ones we've taken off, and they are all species which I think have continued to increase. At the moment, it's Mediterranean gull and avocet, which we will be discussing next week. Actually, our annual in-person red breeding bird panel meeting is here in Northumberland next week. We'll be discussing those species, and possibly little egret as well.
Right.
So, but we are conservative about it and not in a rush to take species off, because we don't want to look stupid.
Thank you. So, what is the next question? So, some people may suppress records for obvious reasons, but there are benefits of collecting as much data as possible to support conservation. Do you have a view as to how much information may be missed?
Um, It varies between species and between areas. We know that, I mean, some of the information you have to be careful. You end up sounding like Donald Rumsfeld and known unknowns and so forth when you talk about it. But we know there are species which just aren't seen by people.
Yeah.
Breeding attempts in parts of Scotland for a lot of species which are no one knows. They're just not counted. So it's more the ones that are seen by people and not reported that are a concern. And we know that there is some data withholding. We know there are still some people, some groups of observers in some cases, which don't share data with us, or they do share information, but they don't give us the details. So particularly for birds of prey, it's often concern still about birds of prey. Yeah, there are understandable reasons, notwithstanding the fact that the data is safe with us. So yeah, we might get told that there are this many pairs in this county. And that's rather frustrating because we can't, one, it's of less value. We can't identify the best sites for species because we don't know where they are. We can't inform conservation work. I've had cases where people have come to me to know, asking about honey buzzards with regards to wind farm developments, which might well be in honey buzzard breeding territories. And we've just had to say, I'm sorry, we can't tell you because the people who work on honey buzzards won't tell us where they are. So there's a risk of wind farms going up in territories because no one's prepared to say where they are. So there are some problems there, but it's improving all the time. We are, building relationships, talking to the right people, and more people who withheld data previously are starting to share it. So, yeah, we're slow.
Thank you. So, just a general bit of feedback from one of our folks here. Very interesting and good to hear positive feedback. Thank you. Most informative. Next question: do the annual RBBP reports disaggregate breeding records, stroke data to county level, i.e. Essex, or do they purely report summaries at the regional or UK England level?
Everything's broken down to county level.
Right, brilliant.
We
Thank you.
rarely talk about sites. We don't mention places, and our sort of high level stats are based on countries. But every species we break down, and we will give a number for the number of pairs, the number of sites at a county level. So if you want to know what's in Essex, you can find out exactly the numbers.
Brilliant. Thank you. Some more feedback. Really enjoyed this talk. Thank you. Great talk. Very informative. Thank you. Another question: is the climate change related northern movement of breeding species, both within the UK and from southern latitudes into the country, accelerating in recent years, or is the increase steady?
I think it's hard to be too precise on that, whether it's accelerating or not. Possibly. So in can't remember the year. About 15 years ago, there was a book published modeling, it's called a climatic atlas. A couple of friends of mine, Brian Huntley and Rhys Green, trying to predict where bird populations would move in Europe based on predicted climate change. So where they were when mapped by the European Bird Census Council in the first European Breeding Bird Atlas in the 1980s, and using climate predictions and distributions of birds and trying to predict where they would move to and where they would be by late in this current century. So they present maps in the book of this is where we think these species will be breeding. And many species are already reaching where Huntley and Green thought they would be by the sort of towards the end of this century. They're already reaching that. So things are, whether it's accelerating or whether they were just a bit sort of too conservative, species are moving pretty rapidly. We are, as is the common pattern with climate change, we're seeing the leading edge, as they call it, so the northward edge of species moving faster than the trailing edge. So species are moving north faster than they're contracting, which sort of explains some of the patterns we're seeing. So we're seeing spoonbills and cattle egrets and stilt arriving rapidly and increasing rapidly, but we're not seeing the Scottish species that we're worried about decreasing quite as fast, although we're seeing those impacts on Slavonian grebes, Mabley and Capercaillie. These are climate impacts. So at the moment, we're getting the good news faster than we're getting the bad news. But we sort of know eventually the bad news will probably catch up.
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks very much. We've got a couple more comments. So excellent talk. Thank you very much. Such an interesting and informative talk, Mark. Many thanks. And then one last question on here. Someone is asking whether you've got a crystal ball, and if so, what do you think the next UK breeding species may be after this year's Zitting Ciscicolas in Suffolk? That's
Last time I was asked this, I think I said Blythe's reed warbler, and they bred last year, so
right.
I can't say Blythe's reed warbler any longer. I would either say red flank bluetail, which is another species with a surprising pattern that it's expanded very substantially westward from just being a Russian breeder and now is present in really quite large numbers in Finland and moving into other Scandinavian countries, into Norway and Sweden. So I think, yeah, we might see breeding red flank bluetail somewhere in Scotland at some point, or I think the other guess would be one of those great reed warblers, one of those poor male great reed warblers that have been turning up year after year all over the country and not attracting a female. Despite the fact that the singing great reed warbler can be heard from miles away. They're one of the loudest warblers you can imagine. Surely one of them has got to be successful at some point. So that would be my other guess.
Well, either would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
Yes.
But
yes.
both would be even better.
Indeed.
I think that's everything. Yeah, everyone's just saying a great talk, Mark. Thanks very much. We're very, very grateful. Fantastic topic and extremely well delivered. So thank you very much. And thanks for your time this evening.
Well, absolute pleasure. Lovely to talk to you. Lovely to talk to an Essex audience. After I was saying to Paul earlier, I was a student in Colchester many decades ago. So yeah, I have a fondness for Essex, and I look forward to you all getting out there and finding lots of rare breeding birds and submitting those data to Tim and getting some great information from Essex.
Fantastic. Thanks very much again.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers, Mark.
Night, everyone.
Good night.